Okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Now, the thing about Franklin Roosevelt, I think the reason why he's so popular, as we mentioned, this guy was elected to 4 terms as President of the United States. Unprecedented, and that was before we had the amendment to the Constitution that limited a president's term. We mentioned, I think, last week that Dwight D. Eisenhower would be the first president that would be limited by 2 terms. And so Roosevelt was very popular. To get elected 4 times is pretty incredible. And I often think about recent presidents. I look at, I mean, whether you agree with it or not, I think if Barack Obama runs again and can, I think he would win I think he'd have won a 3rd term. I go back, I think George W. Bush could have possibly won a 3rd term. I think Bill Clinton, despite his problems, had a 72% approval rating when he left office, which is the highest in American history. Probably could have got elected to another 3rd term. Poor George W. never got a 2nd. Reagan is another one that I think with the popularity he had could have maybe gone a 3rd term. So there have been some that could, but you couldn't at that point. So Franklin Roosevelt has the distinction of being elected to 4 terms as president. He doesn't live long into his 4th. And we'll talk about that next year when we get into World War II. But we'll start out with how he gets involved, and that will be the election of 1932. Election of 1932. Now, who's the President of the United States right now? Had kind of a tough go because of the Depression. Herbert Hoover. Very good, Ryland. And he is actually going to be nominated for re-election. That may surprise you. But in the summer of 1932, the Republican Party ends up nominating President Hoover for re-election. My opinion is at that point, when that nomination was made, this thing was over. I don't think the Republicans had a shot in any way, shape, or form. The Democrats countered with Franklin D. Roosevelt from New York for president and John Nance Garner. This fellow right up here, we finally get a point to the board. John Nance Garner of Texas as his vice presidential running mate. So the Democrats counter with Franklin D. Roosevelt from New York for president and John Nance Garner of Texas as his running mate. Now remember, Roosevelt ran unsuccessfully, did he not, for vice president? Okay, but his name was out there. Well, as I mentioned, because of the Great Depression, Americans were very eager to find a new leader for the United States. I think when Herbert Hoover was nominated for re-election, this thing was over from the start. And as a result, Roosevelt and the Democratic Party win 472 electoral votes to 59. That's got to be one of the lowest accumulation of electoral votes that a sitting president has ever received. So 472 electoral votes for Franklin Roosevelt, 59 for President Hoover. 472 to 59. Now again, what's Roosevelt hoping happens in Congress during this election? Yeah, he's hoping that the Democrats control Congress. And he's lucky because in the election of 1932, the Democrats are going to win both houses of Congress, giving the president-elect the support that he's going to need to solve all these problems of the Great Depression. So the Democratic Party wins both houses of Congress. Why do you think they won both houses? You know, Democrats haven't been overly popular as presidential candidates in our election. But the Great Depression, yeah, everybody looked at the Republicans as the reason why we had the Depression. So the Democrats really gained a ton in the election of 1932. Now, President-elect Roosevelt promised the American people a new deal to pull the nation out of its problems. And that became the name of Franklin Roosevelt's administration, the New Deal. They still talk about New Deal politics in our country today. Okay? All right, that'll take us into a profile of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Kind of an interesting guy. Profile of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30th of 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. And I believe Hyde Park is on your ID sheet, is it not? Okay. So Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. He was an only child. He was born to James and Sarah Roosevelt. Only child. Franklin was the only child born of James and Sarah Roosevelt. And both James Roosevelt, his father, and Sarah Roosevelt, his mother, came from very wealthy families. Both came from very wealthy families. So Franklin Roosevelt's not going to be hurting for anything during his growing up because his family, his mother and father, both came from money, so to speak. Now, this is some of the more interesting things about the Roosevelt family. His father was 53 when Franklin was born. His mother was 26. So there was quite an age difference between Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt. Not quite 30 years, but close. Okay? Now, because of their wealth, Franklin was educated under private tutors until he was 14 years old. Didn't really go to school. He was educated, homeschooled, so to speak, and the family provided private tutors until the age of 14. So he was a homeschool product, so to speak, before homeschools were real prevalent, and his parents hired private tutors to educate him until he was 14. When he turned 14, he was sent to a private school in Massachusetts. He did very well academically, although historians say he was very shy and had very few close friends. So after his homeschooling until the age of 14, his parents put him in a private school in Massachusetts. He did very well academically there, but was said to be very shy and having very few close friends. After he graduated from a private high school in 1900, he enrolled at Harvard University, majoring in history. After graduating from a private high school in 1900, Franklin Roosevelt enrolled at Harvard University and majored in history. He's very bright. It only took him 3 years to graduate from Harvard. It's pretty impressive. So he graduates from Harvard in 3 years with a major in history, and then he enrolls at Columbia University Law School. So it only takes Franklin Roosevelt 3 years to get out of college, which is pretty big, pretty important, or pretty impressive, especially when it's Harvard. And as soon as he graduates from Harvard, in 3 years, he enters Columbia University Law School. Well, this is another little bit of an idiosyncrasy. Franklin began to court his distant cousin, Eleanor. Began to court his distant cousin, Eleanor. And he did that while he was at Harvard, and they became engaged in 1903. So Franklin began to court his distant cousin, Eleanor, while enrolled at Harvard University, and in 1903 the couple became engaged. Now, I'm an only child, and I know that how mothers can be with their only children. I was spoiled in different ways. I never made my own bed in my life until I got married. My wife made me learn how because my mother did it for me. So only children are a little bit spoiled in different ways, some monetarily, some otherwise. Well, when Franklin's mother found out that he planned on marrying Eleanor, she was unhappy. Why? What? No, that really didn't bother her. What bothered her is she did not want another woman in his life. He's an only child. He's a mama's boy, so to speak. And mom was a little bit jealous, not for weird reasons, but jealous that some other woman was now going to share in his life. I never had any daughters. But I think the hardest thing in life would be to walk your daughter down the aisle and turn her over to some other guy after you've raised her till she's however old she is when she got married. Maybe that's why the good Lord didn't give me any daughters. I think that would be very difficult. I've seen a lot of fathers become emotional when they give away their daughters because they love their daughters and they're giving their daughter away to another guy, so to speak, and hoping that guy can take care of that daughter like he maybe thought they should be taken care of. But I think that Franklin's mother was a little bit that same way, but she was a little overboard, okay? Now, she tried like crazy to change his mind about the marriage. She even took him on a Caribbean cruise in hopes that he would forget Eleanor and the marriage deal. So the mother was against the marriage, not because it was a distant cousin, but because she didn't want another woman in his life, and even took him on a Caribbean cruise, hoping to kind of take his mind off Eleanor and maybe he would lose interest. Well, despite the mother's efforts, Franklin and Eleanor were married on March 17, 1905. March 17, 1905. And guess who gave away the bride, which was actually his niece? Who gave away the bride? No. Who gave away the bride, and the bride was actually this guy's niece? You know, somebody gives away the bride, usually the father. Obviously, there must not have been a father in the picture here. So who gave away the bride? It was his niece.
Roosevelt's dad.
Close. Come on. We've talked about him before. Who? Theodore Roosevelt gave away the bride. He gave away his niece. So the man that gave away the bride at the wedding of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt was Teddy Roosevelt. He gave away the bride. It was his niece. Now, girls, I want you to think about this before you get engaged to and or marry an only child. See if this would work for you. So, what do Eleanor and Franklin do? They go on a honeymoon. That's what you do after you get married. And during the time they were on their honeymoon, Franklin's mother took it upon herself to rent a house for the newlyweds and furnish it completely to her taste. Oh yeah. Now listen, I'm glad Carolyn didn't know any of this stuff before she decided to marry this only child. Although my mother was a handful. So, while the Roosevelts were on their honeymoon, Franklin's mother took it upon herself to rent a house for the newlyweds and furnish it completely to her taste. Now, if you are Eleanor Roosevelt and you get back from your honeymoon, McKenna, what is your first thought that you would do? You get back from your honeymoon and you see that your mother-in-law has rented you a house of her choice and decorated it just like she wanted. What would you do? You'd have two choices. What would be your choices? What would be your choices? But I'll tell you what, somebody ought to marry her because she's easy to get along with. What would you do if you came home, Mackenzie, and your husband's mother had rented you a house without consulting you and furnished it just like she wanted to? What would be your two choices when you got back and saw that arrangement? What would be your two choices? You could be really mad, or you could accept it. I don't know about being appreciative, but you could accept it. Well, Eleanor chose, knowing Franklin's mother, that rather than anger her new mother-in-law, she simply accepted the arrangement and went on with life, which in this case probably was smart. So, rather than anger her new mother-in-law, Eleanor Roosevelt accepted the arrangement and went on with life. Now, during their marriage, the Roosevelts had 6 children. They had 5 boys and 1 girl. And the rest were pretty healthy with the exception of one. Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. died in infancy in 1909. So their firstborn, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., died in infancy in 1909. Now this is kind of interesting because the rest of their children, some died in the 1970s, some died in the 1980s, and James Roosevelt, their youngest, actually lived until 1991. So they had a good life expectancy. So you might be thinking, oh gee, he married his second cousin, or just not second, distant cousin, and there'd be problems, you know how that goes. That's how distant they were related in a way. But their children were very healthy. Other than the death of their first child in 1909, the remaining children lived throughout the decades of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and James Roosevelt died in 1991. That's pretty incredible when you think about it. Now, what do you have to do? We'll go back to Columbia Law School. Alexa, what is Franklin going to have to do if he's going to be a lawyer after he gets done with his schooling in Columbia Law School? To be a lawyer, you still got to do what? Yeah, you got to pass your bar exam. Very good. And he passed his bar exam in 1907. Passed his bar exam. But he really didn't have any interest in the study of law. and decided to enter politics. Okay? Passed his bar examination in 1907. But he really didn't have any interest in the study of law, so he left Columbia University, and in 1910, he ran for and was elected to the United States Senate. In 1910, he was ran for and elected to the United States Senate. How old was he?
32, 38.
When was he born?
28.
92?
28, yeah.
20, actually he was 29. Yeah. 29. That's pretty young to be a senator, don't you think? You don't see a lot of 29-year-old senators. So in 1910, Franklin Roosevelt was elected to the United States Senate at the age of 29. Now, you want to hear kind of a weird one? You remember when Woodrow Wilson ran against Theodore Roosevelt in the 1912 presidential election? Franklin Roosevelt supported Wilson, not his cousin. Why? Because they were both Democrats, right? Wilson's a Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt's a Democrat, Theodore Roosevelt was not. He was running on a different party, and so he actually threw his support behind Woodrow Wilson against his cousin Theodore in the 1912 presidential election. Now, what did Wilson do for Franklin Roosevelt? He appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. There's always a give and take on this. So because Franklin Roosevelt supported Woodrow Wilson in the election of 1912, his appreciation was granted to Franklin by Wilson appointing Franklin Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, you probably don't have to write this next thing down. You should know it. Remember, Roosevelt ran for the vice presidency in 1920 with James M. Cox, but they were defeated by Warren Harding. So what did Roosevelt do from 1920 to 1932 when he was elected president? He simply returned to private life. Okay? So from his loss in 1920 for the vice presidency until he decided to run in 1932, Roosevelt simply returned to private life. Well, on August 9th of 1921, not long after losing that election, on August 9th of 1921, not long after losing that election, Roosevelt was at a family summer home in Canada. He was at a family summer home in Canada. He fell into the water while sailing and became very chilled. Okay? On August 9th of 1921, while he was at the family summer home in Canada, Franklin falls into the water while sailing and becomes very chilled. Well, he got up the next day and he felt very tired. He decided to go swimming to refresh himself. But when he finished swimming and went back to the home, he felt even more tired. So he thought when he got up that morning, he was feeling a little bit punky. Thought, oh, let's go take a quick swim, kind of get myself rejuvenated. So he goes out and takes a quick swim, comes back, and ends up being more tired than he was before he went on the swim. Well, the next morning, he notices that neither of his legs were working properly. The next morning, he notices that neither of his legs are working properly. And by August 12th, he can't even stand or move his legs. So by August 12th, Franklin Roosevelt can neither stand up nor can he move his legs. By August 12th, he couldn't stand up or move his legs. In addition to that, he suffered severe pain and his arms and hands became partially paralyzed. So in addition to him not being able to stand up or move his legs, his arms and hands became partially paralyzed and he was in severe pain. So what would you do? You'd go to the doctor and figure out what your issue was, would you not? And what was he diagnosed with? Polio at the age of 39. So he sought medical opinion And as a result of his symptoms, doctors diagnosed Franklin Roosevelt with polio at the age of 39. Well, you know, when you get polio and your arms and legs aren't working very well, you got to go through exercise and therapy. And he worked very hard, putting in years of grueling exercise and therapy to try to improve his condition. And he did regain the use of his hands and arms and shoulders, but his legs were going to be an issue. Okay? So he works very hard to develop strength back in his hands and arms and shoulders. And his legs did improve a little bit, but he's never going to walk again without help or the use of leg braces. Okay, so the polio is going to make us completely change Franklin Roosevelt's life. He's going to gain control of his hands and arms and shoulders, but he will never again walk without help or the use of leg braces. Well, despite that, he returns to politics in 1928. And he's elected governor of New York. He returns to politics in 1928 and is elected governor of New York. Had a very successful run as governor of New York, and he was re-elected in 1930. And by 1932, Andy, what did he want to do? Run for president. So he served successfully 2 terms as governor of New York, and by 1932 he has his sights set on the presidency.